Hello, 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 everybody. Welcome to this extremely interesting lecture that you're going to discover a lot of facts and analysis that perhaps you were not that familiar with. And this lecture is a example of a great cooperation between two prominent organizations, the Jewish Heritage Alliance, that you will hear more about it in a minute, and Beth Torah Benny Rock campus in Miami. In particular, my name is Hugo Hurwitz. I'm the director of the chairman of adult education at Beth Torah. We have a very active series of lectures on a variety of topics, mostly Jewish topics, current events, um, very interesting series of topics that I invite all of you. We have some people that are not regular followers of our lecture series, and I invite you to join us and to sign up to our mailing list. If you want to be included in our mailing list, you can enter your emails in the chat or send me a DM, a direct message with your email, and I will include you in our email list for future events. Before I tell you more about today's event, I want to remind you, those of you who are in Miami, about two um, um, very interesting, very important Hanukkah-related events in person in Miami at Beth Torah on Tuesday, December 16th. That is a week from tomorrow. We will have a lecture co-sponsored between Beth Torah and SAGE, the Central Agency of Jewish Education. Uh, the lecture is with a celebration of Hanukkah. It will be the third night of Hanukkah. We will light candles, but there will be a very interesting lecture by Dr. David Briefman about Israel education in the US, the impact of October 7th on the way that Jewish institutions in the US go about talking and teaching about Israel. Very interesting program. So that's a week from tomorrow in person at Beth Torah. The next day, there is a family event at Beth Torah for families and children. And that event will be Wednesday, December 17th at 4 p.m. And it's called Hanukkah Under the Stars. Hanukkah Under the Stars with games and music. Very, very happy event every year at Beth Torah in person with families, adults, and children. That's Wednesday, December 17th. And our adult education series will continue in January. We will be publishing next week the full schedule for the spring semester. That's what we call it, the semester from January to May. And we have a whole series of lectures lined up. The first one is on January the 12th. On January the 12th of next year, I will be talking about the situation in Israel and the Middle East, the new geopolitics of the situation between Israel, the US, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and so on. So it will be a timely analysis of the situation in the Middle East. Okay, now back to today's event. And today's event, we of course we have a Professor Isaac Amon, who will be introduced in a minute. But I want to introduce now Michael Steinberger. Michael Steinberger is the CEO, founder, and the brains of the operations of the great leader of the Jewish Heritage Alliance. The Jewish Heritage Alliance has a lot of activities, and so Michael is going to tell you a little bit about the Jewish Heritage Alliance and also introduce our speaker today. So Michael, the floor is yours.
So thank you. Thank you. First of all, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Hurwitz, for inviting us to share the Sefarad legacy with your community. And thank you to everyone for joining us here this evening. I'm going to be very brief so we can go to the main event. So real brief, my name is Michael Steinberger. I am founder and CEO of Jewish Heritage Alliance, a nonprofit dedicated to researching, preserving, and most importantly, promoting the legacy of Sefarad. The word Sefarad in Hebrew literally means Spain, but historically speaking, it refers to the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, nowadays Spain and Portugal. We are proud to partner with Beth Torah this evening to deliver this very interesting educational event led by our very own Dr. Isaac Amon. Dr. Amon is the Director of Academic Research at Jewish Heritage Alliance and an attorney. He also serves as a lecturer at the Washington University School of Law in St. Louis, and was recently named a fellow at the London Center for Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. A grandson of Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi immigrants, Dr. Amon previously served as a legal fellow at the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia in The Hague and as an ISIS war crimes investigator. He frequently speaks on the law, anti-Semitism, Jewish memory, with a particular focus on the Inquisition and the Holocaust. And so with that, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Isaac. Take it away, Isaac.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Hugo, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here virtually with Congregation Beth Torah and everyone else wherever you may be joining from. And so today we will talk on what I hope you find to be an incredibly fascinating and moving and significant topic, which is From Inquisition to Religious Freedom, the story of Sephardic Jews mainly. There are also conversos, there are some Ashkenazi Jews as well, and the impact they had upon the early American Republic and the broader story of religious liberty, something taking on added significance as we rapidly approach America's 250th birthday next July 4th. And so the three threads in our magnificent tapestry this evening are as follows. The first is, of course, a brief overview of the history of Sefarad. As Michael mentioned, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and the Inquisition. The second is the Age of Enlightenment that gave birth to the ideal of liberty of conscience. And the third is, of course, the place where that ideal of liberty of conscience or religious freedom found its most fertile soil, or its greatest residence, and that is the American experiment. And I hope you will find, ladies and gentlemen, at the very end, that this story and this legacy is deeply antithetical to the surge of anti-Semitism that is engulfing many Jewish communities around the world, including in the United States in the post-October 7th era. So, beginning with history, beginning with Sefarad. Jews lived in Spain and Portugal or Sefarad for 1,500 to 2,000 years. There was a communal Jewish presence, certainly in Roman times, in the first century or so of the Common Era. And over time, of course, there were periods of, especially the so-called Golden Age, but there were also periods of persecution, of massacres, and of forced conversions. And this culminates in a way with the establishment of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. The Spanish was created in 1478 and the Portuguese in 1536. They're not the first Inquisitions in European history. There was a medieval Inquisition in the 1200s. There was a Roman Inquisition, which actually was a contemporary of the Spanish and Portuguese, notoriously tried the Italian scientist Galileo in the 1600s for heresy. All Inquisitions are concerned with heresy or dissent or deviance from officially canonized dogma or creed. And in the Iberian context, Spain and Portugal, they came to have a pathological obsession with a singular type of heresy, that of crypto-Judaism, that of Jews who had been forcibly converted in most cases over centuries to Catholicism. Officially, they came to be known by the church and society as New Christians, as Cristianos Nuevos in Spain, or Cristãos Novos in Portugal, or quite simply conversos. And of course, the derogatory epithet that's often been applied is Moranos, has the connotation of pig or swine, at least in Spain. And so to ferret out the crypto-Judaism amongst these conversos or New Christians, the church, the Inquisition, compiled and promulgated detailed legal procedures because in the eyes of the church, heresy was a grievous sin. It put in peril one's immortal soul. And the only rectifying feature would be confession. And so to obtain the confession, which came to be known as the Queen of Proofs in the law, torture was utilized, though not as frequently as we might assume from popular consciousness. But you can see a couple of the methods on the right. You have the rack. You also have the garucha or the pulley system. And these could, of course, dislocate limbs and eventually shatter bones. Three legal methods utilized notoriously by the Inquisition as well were the following. Upon denunciation, there was no presumption of innocence. There was actually a presumption of guilt. So, in stark contrast to our system and in the criminal justice system today, the person was presumed to be guilty upon arrest. Second, the proceedings were infamously kept secret. The prisoner was not to be informed of the charges against them. And lastly, they were never permitted to know the names or identity of the accusers or adverse witnesses. And so this effectively precluded, as we might rightly assume, any adequate defense. And this long inquisitorial process, of which I could speak much more, culminates in the so-called Act of Faith, the auto de fe, staged in cities around the world where the Inquisition had jurisdiction. It was composed of penitents, prayers, sermons. The accused would learn what their fate was. And in many cases, of course, you can see, certainly, again, this is the image we have in our consciousness. The accused would be taken to the outskirts of the city. This is supposed to be an illustration of the auto de fe, of the mass burnings in Lisbon at the Tuero do Pazo or the Praça de Comercial, where the accused or the publicly condemned would be burnt at the stake, usually alive, before a multitude. So the Spanish Inquisition, as aforementioned, had been created in 1478, and this procedure, this process, had been unfolding, as we have just talked about. The auto de fes were occurring throughout Spain. In 1492, the professing Jews were expelled en masse, March 31st, from the Alhambra, this citadel and fortress located at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in Granada, Spain, that you can see in the photo. Magnificent building. And King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella signed the Edict of Expulsion, or the Alhambra Decree, and a copy is seen on the right, and it is signed by the King and the Queen. It's embossed with the royal seal, and it forever expelled all professing Jews from Spain and their descendants forevermore. And this shattered the unity of Sefarad, or Iberian Jewry, which, again, it had a continuous presence for at least 1,500 to 2,000 years and made great contributions to not only, of course, the Jewish world, but importantly to Spanish and Portuguese society. And so this, again, shatters the unity. The diaspora begins, and you can see on this map where they went. The red arrows throughout the Mediterranean basin represent where the Spanish Jews left in 1492. Those who did not convert to Catholicism, though many did. It's often said at least half, if not more, did convert to Catholicism under great duress. But the others went, you can see, to North Africa, to Morocco, to Algeria, to Tunisia, where they encountered the pre-existing, the indigenous Jewish communities. So the Mizrahi Jews, so you already start to see this convergence of many Sephardi and Mizrahi communities. Others went to the Italian peninsula, led by the famed biblical commentator Don Isaac of Bravanel, whose commentary is still studied today. Others went throughout the Mediterranean to the far eastern end, to the Levant, to Egypt, to the land of Israel, up into what is even now Syria, and into Turkey and Greece, the heartland of the Ottoman Empire. My own ancestors went to Istanbul, and they went on and up into the Balkans. And the black arrows represent where the Jews of Portugal, or the new Christians, when they were able to leave, they left in succeeding decades and centuries, went particularly to Northern and Western Europe, and from there throughout the New World. And so all these branches, though, of what the tree of Sefarad was, kind of are created at this moment in time by the stroke of a pen, by the signature of the king and the queen. Now, many Jews, they left Spain in order to preserve their openly professing Jewish identity, but they didn't wish to leave the Iberian Peninsula, or they were unable to do so to make the dangerous trek to the Ottoman Empire or to North Africa. And so they sought safety, a refuge in the Kingdom of Portugal on the same peninsula, similar culture, similar language. And they thought, again, they had found a place of safety. Well, in spring 1497, King Manuel I, whose drawing of him is seen at the top, he forcibly converted the normative Jewish community of Portugal. And unlike Spain, they did not have the ability to leave. They were not given a choice. They were forcibly converted. Manuel went further. He closed synagogues and schools, confiscated ritual objects such as Torah scrolls, prayer books, even uplifted Jewish cemeteries. And this was all to extirpate the very memory of Judaism, to make it impossible for the now Portuguese New Christians who were former Jews to ever revert, or for their descendants to ever revert to Judaism. And the coup de grace, as it were, was in April 1506. About 2,000 to 4,000 new Christians were slaughtered in the street of in the heart of Lisbon in the Rocio Square. And a few years ago, when I went, I had the honor, in a way, I went to bear witness, and this is the spot where the massacre occurred, as he says, neste largo, due to religious intolerance and fanaticism. And ultimately, the aim of the Spanish and Portuguese monarchs was to really create a society ultimately free of Judaism and Jewish memory, or as it has been termed, religiocide. And this is but one step short of destroying the people, right, of genocide, something that we have witnessed in our collective living memory. Now, for the Portuguese New Christians, as I said, they left in later decades and centuries. They went, in many cases, retracing the steps of their co-religionists or former co-religionists from Spain. They went to Southern Europe. They went to the Ottoman Empire. But again, they particularly went to Northern and Western Europe, and they established communities in Hamburg and Amsterdam, and they led the readmission to London. And they came to strongly identify with their Portuguese roots. Hence, they became known as Hebrews of the Portuguese nation, or Homens de Nassau, an identity that they carried with them, and that, in a way, is still applicable today. In Amsterdam, they arrived as early as the 1590s, still as new Christians. And by 1639, though, they had become openly professing Jewish communities. The Sephardic community eventually unified. And in 1648, there was a very big arrival of Ashkenazi Jews fleeing persecution in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Cossack attacks in the wake of the Khmelnytsky uprising. And in 1675, the very majestic Esnoga, the Portuguese synagogue that you can see at the top and at the bottom, it was inaugurated. It was dedicated. It's a magnificent example of Dutch architecture. It survived the Nazi occupation. Alas, the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, direct descendants of the Portuguese New Christians, they did not. 95% of the Portuguese Jewish community was deported to Auschwitz and died during the Holocaust. But the building still stands. It's very worth the visit if you get the chance. And it just commemorated its 350th anniversary this year. In London, again, the Portuguese New Christians were now Jews, led the readmission beginning in 1656, 57. Menashe ben Israel, who was born a Portuguese New Christian, became a rabbi. He used his fame. He went to England, actually met with Oliver Cromwell, who was serving as the head of state, the Lord Protector of the English Commonwealth following the abolition of the English monarchy. And while Cromwell was sympathetic to the Jews' petition to be readmitted for the first time since they'd been expelled by King Edward I in 1290, he did not, or he could not openly allow them to return, but he did allow them to stay unmolested by the English state. And this marks the effective birth of the readmission or resettlement of the Sephardic community of London. This was providential because in 1660, the English monarchy was restored, and King Charles II reversed Cromwell's decrees. Well, there was never an official decree permitting the Jews to return, and hence they were permitted to stay. In 1663, the noted diarist Samuel Pepys, who detailed much of mid-17th century London, such as the plague and the fire, actually visited the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. And as he says in his diary, they had a prayer for the king in Portuguese, an homage to their Portuguese ancestry as new Christians, but the rest was in Hebrew. And in 1701, that Spanish and Portuguese synagogue moved to Bevis Marks Lane, to the site it inhabits to this day. It's the only synagogue in all of Europe, and again, almost certainly the entire world, to have held continuous services for more than 300 years. And a couple of years ago, I had the privilege to go and visit the rabbi. And following this readmission to London and the establishment of these Jewish communities, they crossed the Atlantic and established Spanish and Portuguese synagogues and communities throughout the Caribbean and the Americas, from Recife, Brazil, which was the very first openly professing Jewish community in the Western Hemisphere, founded in 1636, all the way up to Montreal, Canada, of course, including the East Coast or the Eastern Seaboard of what became the United States. These synagogues endure today, and all of these names hint at a final redemption, not just, of course, a respite from inquisitorial persecution, but a belief in an eventual ingathering of the exiles and a return to the Jewish people. And their very names, again, hint at it. They're all variants of remnant, hope, dispersed, or salvation of Israel. And so, as has been described by Suleiman Halevi, this became a veritable global circuit of Iberian Jews and conversos, Sephardic Jewishness, encompassing both openly professing Jews and conversos. It really went around the world. It traversed the Caribbean to the Atlantic, to the ancestral Iberian Peninsula, to the communities in Northern and Western Europe, even to the Ottoman Empire. And the cultural coherence that was the result of these multiple and intersecting networks underpinned this remarkable capacity to cross religious, political, and cultural divides. You can see the white arrows represent the Spanish voyages of conquest and colonization, particularly to Latin America. And the Portuguese are in the blue arrows. And wherever the Spanish and the Portuguese went, many conversos, many of whom were undoubtedly crypto Jews, they accompanied these voyages hoping to find a place free from the long arm of the Spanish and later Portuguese Inquisitions. Well, the Inquisitions in Spain and Portugal were quite cognizant of this heresy in their eyes, unwilling to tolerate it at home. They certainly were not allowing these people to traverse the globe unhindered. And so they established subsidiary tribunals, inquisitions, in their overseas colonies. It's actually quite remarkably shocking and astonishing and disturbing how far, literally to the ends of the earth, the Inquisitions went to uncover and suppress this heresy. They established, the Spanish did, in Mexico City to oversee Mexico, New Mexico, so the future United States, Panama, and even the Philippines across the Pacific Ocean. They established a tribunal in Lima, Peru, until they established another one as well in Cartagena, Colombia, to oversee South America and the Caribbean. And the Portuguese established a very ruthless and infamous tribunal in Goa, India, to oversee the Portuguese colonies in Africa and Asia. And they empowered the Bishop of Bahia, which was the capital of Portuguese Brazil, to identify and extradite suspected heretics to Lisbon to stand trial. And this map, I think, ladies and gentlemen, really showcases quite vividly the incredible extent, again, of a veritable worldwide reach of the Inquisitions, a global reign of terror. They had a presence in every ocean on 5 continents, from the Americas to Asia, into, as you can see, even Goa and Cochin in India, to Hormuz, to the Persian Gulf, to the Atlantic Ocean. There were very few places around the world where the conversos, the crypto Jews, could find any respite, again, from the worldwide reach of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. In this geographical and generational reign, again, of persecution, of obsessing to try to find and uncover and suppress any Jewish memory, was unprecedented, certainly until the Holocaust. Ultimately, our repugnance at the Inquisition, I think, is not just because of the sheer numbers. That's part of the story. It's estimated that 200,000 people stood trial before the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, not all conversos, not all for crypto-Judaism. But again, that was that formative impulse, the persecuting impulse in the early years of the tribunal's existence. But 200,000 people stood trial, 1.5 million were hauled before the tribunals, it's estimated, in some capacity. But the very essence of our repugnance is the point of the Inquisition. It was to punish deviance, any dissent from prevailing societal norms and beliefs. It shocks our conscience today, but it was shocking to contemporaries even then. And the Inquisition could very well be the epitome of what we would call menticide, an organized and bureaucratized state effort to destroy the mind, our liberty of conscience. And the movement that arose to condemn menticide to the greatest extent was the Enlightenment. In 17th and 18th century Europe, dedicated to exploring interrelated conceptions of God, reason, nature, and man, a belief that the deity had endowed human beings with reason and rationality to figure out problems of human society. It was a belief that it could lead to happiness and greater human unity. And this sparked intellectual and policy debates across the continent. And in this milieu, there came increasing calls for respect for religious dissenters and liberty of conscience. And the Inquisition increasingly came to be seen as contrary to the very rights of man, or human rights. some of the intellectuals whose names are certainly familiar to most people, if not all of us, uh, today were involved in these debates, including John Locke of England, Baruch Spinoza in the Netherlands, himself the child of Portuguese New Christians who had fled to Amsterdam seeking religious freedom before he was born. The French philosophers or philosophes, Montesquieu and Voltaire in France, and David Hume in Scotland. And a few years ago, I visited his tomb and his statue in Edinburgh. So all of these individuals were involved in these various debates, and the Inquisition was part of that. The Enlightenment's condemnation of the Inquisition even led to marked changes on the Iberian Peninsula itself. No less a figure than the Marquês de Pombal, the prime minister of Portugal for a quarter century in the late 18th century, a contemporary of the founders of the United States. He tried to abolish the Inquisition, and he was not successful. But significantly, he did finally modify the inquisitorial procedure. He mandated common law protections that we have, for example, today, had to be adopted. There could no longer be a secrecy of procedure. The witnesses had to be revealed to the accused, and the details of the alleged crime, the time and the place, had to be provided to the defendant. In Spain, King Carlos III, who's seen at the top, was actually a devotee of the Inquisition. He himself began to curb excesses of the Inquisition, particularly in censorship. And in 1779, during the American Revolution, which we'll look at very soon, John Adams, the future American president, visited Spain en route to France to solicit help for the American Revolution. And Adams notes in his own diary that while there, he met with some high-ranking government ministers, and he asked explicitly about the Inquisition. And he was told that in Spain, the Inquisition was grown much milder and had lost much of its influence. Europe in general was much enlightened and grown more moderate, and public opinion in Spain revolted against the cruelties of the Inquisition. All of this was the prelude, ladies and gentlemen, to the American experiment. The legacy of inquisitorial persecution, the global migration of conversos and Sephardic Jews, the Enlightenment's dedication to liberty of conscience came to culminate in the American experiment, to which we now turn, beginning with a very brief look at Jewish history in the earliest colonies. Beginning in Rhode Island, Roger Williams founded that colony. He was born in London and fled to Massachusetts Bay Colony at an early age. Himself fleeing religious persecution, he fled the colony, and in 1636, so the very same year that the Recife Jewish community founded their synagogue, Kahal Sor Israel, interestingly, he founded the very city of Providence because he believed God had saved him to create what he called his lively experiment, a genuine haven for religious freedom. And indeed it was. In 1680, at the end of his life, he summarized his core ethos in a letter to one of his friends, writing quite simply, "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils." The first Jews to arrive in Rhode Island was in the city of Newport, Congregation Yeshuat Israel, or Yeshuat Israel, founded in 1658. When 15 families arrived in the city from the Caribbean, probably via Barbados, they created a cemetery or burying ground in 1677 that still exists to this day in Newport. And a century later or so, in 1763, the congregation officially dedicated the Touro Synagogue. We have a firsthand account of that dedication written by a Congregationalist minister and future president of Yale University, Ezra Stiles, who wrote in his diary, December 2nd, 1763, Friday. This was also, note, Hanukkah, the festival of religious liberty. He says, in the afternoon was the dedication of the new synagogue in this town. Most perfect of the temple kind, perhaps in America, and splendidly illuminated. This could not but raise in the mind a faint idea of the majesty and grandeur of the ancient Jewish worship mentioned in Scripture. Stiles was a Christian Hebraist. He very deeply believed in learning about Judaism. And if you can actually see over his shoulder here, he has a book with Hebrew characters that says Talmud B, so either the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, or Tractate Berachot, which we actually know that he had in his collection. It also says Ibn Ezra, one of the great commentators from the Golden Age of Spain, and Rashi. The most famous arrival story in what became the United States is undoubtedly that in New Amsterdam, the future New York, in 1654. 23 Jews fleeing the arrival of the Portuguese Inquisition, as they had been former conversos, arrived from Recife, Brazil, seeking to disembark at the port of New York. Peter Stuyvesant, the governor or director general, asked the Dutch West India Company, which controlled the colony, not to admit the Jews, calling them Christ killers, blasphemers, traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes. Nonetheless, he was overruled. He was ordered to admit them and to give them permission to live, trade, and travel as long as they did not become a public charge, whereupon they quickly founded Congregation Shereth Israel. And this moment of the 23 creating that synagogue is widely viewed, almost universally viewed, as the genesis of American Jewish history. Well, as we know, no Jew, as the Jacob Rader Marcus, the late 20th century historian of American Jewry, put it, no Jew's ever the first one anywhere. There's always been another one there before. And the 23 from Recife were actually not the first to arrive in New Amsterdam. According to tradition or legend, they were actually met at the port of New York by three Ashkenazi Jews, Solomon Peterson, Jacob Bar Simpson, and Osir Levy. And Levy is significant because in 1655, he actually petitioned the municipal court to become a burgher, meaning he would have the right to bear arms, to stand guard on the city walls, and to avoid having to pay a tax as Jews had been forced to do. And he fought a 2-year legal fight. And incredibly, he actually prevailed in 1657. He won the right, setting a precedent for his future co-religionists. And by this point, the 23 from Recife had actually left to go to Amsterdam. And so Levy remained as one of the sole Jews in the entire colony. We know that he ended up having a family, became a kosher butcher, and a very prominent merchant. And when he died in 1682, he's listed as one of the most notable citizens of the city. In Pennsylvania, this was founded by William Penn, what he called his holy experiment. It's very similar to Roger Williams' lively experiment in Rhode Island. And Penn, at a very early age, was committed to the idea of liberty of conscience. He himself was imprisoned in the Tower of London for dissenting religious opinions. And when urged to recant in order to be released, he declared, "My prison shall be my grave before I will budge a jot, for I owe my conscience to no mortal man." The city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, was founded in the 1680s. And he promulgated his own Charter of Privileges in 1701, which effectively acted as the governing document of the colony. Foremost among them were the ideas of liberty of conscience and a separation of church and state. The first congregation, Mikveh Israel, which still endures to this day, was founded in 1740 when the Jews asked for land for a cemetery from the son of William Penn, which he gave. And in 1702, their very first building was dedicated. And the minutes of the dedication record that Chaim Solomon, whose putative illustration seen at the top, he was the so-called financier of the American Revolution. He was the largest single contributor. In 1788, when the synagogue was facing financial pressure, it's also notable that Benjamin Franklin, at the end of his life, donated some money as well. In Charleston, South Carolina, the governing charter of that colony, the fundamental constitutions, have been drafted by none other than John Locke himself, one of those intellectuals of the Enlightenment. The first Jews seem to have arrived in 1697 when three Jewish merchants, Jacob Bendis, Abraham Avila, and Simon Valentine, petitioned for citizenship. And in the original constitutions, Locke had expressly permitted Jews, heathens, and religious dissenters to settle. And Valentine's petition was accepted, and they became citizens, and the copy of the petition is seen at the top right. Enough Jews gathered over succeeding decades that in 1749 they created their synagogue, Gal Kadosh Beth Elohim, that endures to this day. And in 1776, the very year of the Declaration of Independence, the first Jew to hold public office in the British colonies, Francis Salvador, a Sephardic Jew from London, who believed in the American cause, who had traversed the Atlantic to fight. He himself was killed in battle by Native Americans and scalped a month after Jefferson wrote the immortal words that all men are created equal. Up until 1830 or so, Charleston was the largest Jewish community in the United States. And lastly, we arrive at Savannah, Georgia, the most southern of the colonies, as well as the most southern of the Jewish communities in the colonial period. This was founded in 1733 by General James Oglethorpe. And 5 months after he founded the colony, 41 Jews from London arrived. It was comprised, incredibly enough, of 33 Portuguese Jews who were former conversos and 8 Ashkenazi Jews, 2 families, the Sheftals and the Minuses. They brought with them a Sefer Torah scroll written on deerskin from pre-1492 Iberia, from prior to the expulsion from Spain, as well as a circumcision box. And when the Jews arrived, they found the colony in the grip of epidemic, likely influenza. colonists had died, including Dr. William Cox, the only physician. Well, fortunately, the Jews had a physician on board, Dr. Samuel Nunez, who had been born a converso in Lisbon, who rose to become physician to the king and the Grand Inquisitor himself. And in 1703 or so, in his mid-30s, he and his family were jailed by the Inquisition on charges of Judaizing or practicing crypto-Judaism, which was likely true. And in the 1720s, after managing to somewhat rehabilitate himself, he and his family escaped to London, where they returned to normative Judaism. And in 1733, when they came to Savannah, found the colony in the grip of plague, it was Dr. Nunez who halted the epidemic, saving the colony. Notwithstanding Dr. Nunez's quite literally life-saving medical assistance, the trustees in London ordered Oglethorpe not to admit the Jews, to ban them, fearing that they would disincentivize economic growth, could become a public charge on the colony. Well, Oglethorpe not only defied them, he allowed the Jews to stay, and moreover, he actually granted equal land to Jews and non-Jews, as attested in the records of 1733. And some of the names in the land grants bear witness to that mixed Sephardi-Ashkenazi unity. Abraham Minus, Isaac Nunez Enriquez, Samuel Nunez Ribeiro, his converso name, and Benjamin Sheftel. Oglethorpe in the original Charter of Georgia had banned four things: Catholics, slavery, rum, and lawyers. When Oglethorpe left, the last three were overturned quickly, but the ban on Catholics was not officially lifted until after the American Revolution. And on the right is a photo of the original cemetery or burying ground granted by General Oglethorpe to the Jewish community of Savannah. In 1739 to 42, General Oglethorpe, leading British troops, fought Spanish Florida. Florida, where many of you are, was, of course, actually part of New Spain at the time. And Georgia was created as a buffer zone, a buffer state between the British and the Spanish. And at one point in this War of Jenkins' Ear, the Spanish actually landed troops at St. Simon's Island, a mere 80 miles from Savannah. And so the Sephardic Jews, as former conversos, they feared the arrival of the Inquisition. They feared they would be burnt at the stake as apostates and autos de fe. And so they fled, Dr. Samuel Nunez among them. The two Ashkenazi families, the Sheftels and the Minuses, of course, who had never been Catholic, who had never had any ancestral connections to the Inquisition, they remained in order to maintain a Jewish presence. The community only returned en masse in the 1770s, the time of the American Revolution. The synagogue, or the congregation there, was officially chartered by the governor in 1790. And in an interesting twist of fate, in 1742, Oglethorpe returned to London, never again to return to the colony that he had founded. And at the very end of his life in 1785, Oglethorpe lived to nearly 90 years old. He personally met with John Adams, who was then serving as America's ambassador to London. And according to Adams, Oglethorpe expressed great esteem and regard for the American Republic, which built on his own impressive legacy of religious freedom or tolerance, particularly for Jews. Congregation Mikveh Israel in Savannah is the third oldest synagogue in the United States, the oldest in the American South, and they still proudly preserve that 15th century Torah scroll written on deerskin in their museum. And a few years ago, I had the great honor to be their guest speaker for their 290th anniversary. And right next to me on that table with the blue tablecloth underneath the talit is that 600-year-old Torah scroll written on deerskin, transported across the Atlantic by the founders of that community in 1733. Half a century later, the American Revolution occurred. It's estimated there are about 2,500 Jews living in all 13 colonies out of about 2 million people, a very small percentage of the American population. At least 100 to 150 Jews took up arms and fought in the Continental Army, including 15 officers. 15 Jews became officers in the Continental Army, utterly unprecedented. No Jew could be an officer in any other army in the world. So already in the time of the American Revolution, the American experiment, even in colonial times, was something unique for Jews. While the founders of the United States were informed by European philosophers and thinkers, including those we have mentioned, it was, of course, the United States, the American Revolution, that greatly influenced Europe, such as the French Revolution and others, and eventually the world. On July 4, 1776, came those ringing words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." They declared their independence from Great Britain. And then, of course, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, they mutually pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. A few months before the Declaration of Independence had been signed and publicized to the world, the Virginia Declaration of Rights had come forth. And this document is important because there was a debate already as to what was the language for religious freedom, what should actually be inscribed there. George Mason, who's seen here, one of the founders himself, proposed that everyone should have the fullest toleration of religious belief. And a 25-year-old James Madison, the future author of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, he argued, he says, no one is tolerated in their religious opinions. This is a natural right. This is liberty of conscience. And his language was adopted. The Declaration of Rights in Virginia was changed, and it reads, as it does today, religion can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. All men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience. So this changed the course of history. A decade later or so, after the United States was officially recognized by Great Britain as being an independent country, in 1783, debates still occurred in Virginia and elsewhere over the extent of liberty of conscience. In 1784, there was a bill in Virginia to tax everyone for Christian religious instruction. There was a lot of opposition, and James Madison, he led the opposition in the legislature, and he authored a work known as Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. And part of it explicitly reads, the religion of every man must be left to the conscience of every man. Distant as this proposed bill may be in its present form from the Inquisition, it differs from it only in degree. The one is the first step, the other the last in the career of intolerance. Well, the Assembly, remarkably, in 1785 or 86, they defeated the proposed bill and instead adopted the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, authored by none other than Thomas Jefferson, who at this point was serving as America's ambassador to France. Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, begins this landmark document in the history of Western civilization and liberty of conscience. No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, but all men shall be free to profess, and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion. This meant so much to Thomas Jefferson that when the Jefferson Memorial itself was officially dedicated in Washington, D.C. in 1943, on Jefferson's 200th birthday, an excerpt of this was actually inscribed inside it. And several months ago, when I was in Washington, I visited the monument, and as you can see, I'm actually pointing up to the excerpt from the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Following the passage of the bill, Madison wrote to Jefferson excitedly saying, I flatter myself that we have in this country extinguished forever the ambitious project of making laws for the human mind. In May through September 1787, the very next year, the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia, in William Penn's city of brotherly love. 55 men gathered there, and while they differed from one another in experience and temperament, even in political beliefs, they were all genuinely dedicated to seeing this American experiment succeed. As aforementioned, Adams and Jefferson were absent. They were serving as ambassadors to London and Paris, respectively. And in this magnificent painting, you can see George Washington on the very top, who is the presiding officer or the president of the Constitutional Convention, and the other well-known founders are seated below him: Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. At the very end of the Constitutional Convention, in September, right before the document was to be unveiled, a single private letter, or a petition, was actually, it arrived and it was opened. And it was written by one Jonas Phillips, who is seen on the top right, who was the president of Mikveh Israel of Philadelphia, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, a well-known merchant in the city. And he was an Ashkenazi Jew. His wife, Rebecca Mendez Machado, who's seen on the bottom, was a prominent woman in her own right in Jewish life, and the granddaughter of Dr. Samuel Nunez, who had saved the colony of Savannah from plague. And the pertinent excerpt of the letter, or the petition addressed to George Washington, and by implication all the delegates, was, it's well known among all the citizens of the 13 United States that during the late contest with England, the American Revolution, Jews have been foremost in aiding and assisting the states with their lives and fortunes. Therefore, if the Honorable Convention shall in their wisdom enshrine religious freedom, the Israelites will think themselves happy to live under a government where all religious societies are on an equal footing. I solicit this favor for myself, my children, and posterity, and for the benefit of all the Israelites through the 13 United States of America. This is an extraordinary moment in American Jewish history. Uh, and as remarkable as it was, the founders went one step further. Phillips and everyone else, because the founders had drafted the Constitution in secret, was unaware of the existence of Article 6 of the Constitution, the clause of which says that there is a prohibition on any religious test for any federal office in the United States, meaning that in 1787, the founders of the United States could already conceive that a non-Christian, even a Jew, could one day rise to the highest office in the land, become president of the United States. And this is unprecedented, again, anywhere in the world. In fact, if you look at the various states that existed in 1787, the 13 states, 9 of the 13 prohibited non-Christians from holding public office. And religious tests in North Carolina and New Hampshire actually lasted until after the Civil War in the 1860s. Most other states did eventually, of course, abolish over time. But already in 1787, the founders, again, it could envision this. There was to be no religious test for office. It's also instructive to look across the pond at the British example. The first openly professing Jew allowed to take a seat in Parliament in the House of Commons was Lionel de Rothschild in 1858. He had been elected 4 times previously, was not permitted to take his seat because he would not swear on the New Testament upon the true faith of a Christian, as British law mandated. It finally was changed to allow Jews to do so in 1858. Later, when Prime Minister William Gladstone wanted the Queen Victoria to raise Rothschild to the House of Lords, she demurred, saying it would be improper for a Jew to be appointed to the upper chamber. And yet, in 1885, it was Lionel's son, Nathan, whom Queen Victoria finally appointed and ennobled as the first openly professing Jew in the House of Lords. Again, something the founders already saw and envisioned and welcomed in 1787. And so while Jonas Phillips was unaware, again, of the existence of this religious litmus test clause or the prohibition on it, it presaged growing debates in state ratifying conventions ultimately over the need for a Bill of Rights that people could look to and cite for support. And so at the various state ratifying conventions, there is also reference to persecution, to the Inquisition, to what would happen if we don't have a Bill of Rights. So Patrick Henry, famous for thundering, "Give me liberty or give me death," at the Virginia State Ratifying Convention declared Congress, without a Bill of Rights, may introduce the practice of torturing to extort a confession of the crime. If this happens, we are then lost and undone. Likewise, in Massachusetts, Abraham Holmes wondered, is the criminal to be allowed benefit of counsel, to meet his accuser face to face, to confront the witnesses, to have cross-examination? Without procedural protections in the Bill of Rights, he predicted that one day courts could even be empowered to become like a certain tribunal in Spain, which has long been the disgrace of Christendom. I mean that diabolical institution, the Inquisition. A year later, July 4th, 1788, the very first Independence Day after the Constitution had officially been ratified, while these debates in the state ratifying conventions were ongoing, a grand federal procession was held celebrating American independence. And we have a very nice firsthand account written by Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was one of the founders and is often called the father of American psychiatry. And he wrote in his diary a very nice sight. It's the rabbi of the Jews, whom we know to be Jacob Raphael Cohen of Mikveh, Israel, was locked in the arms of the Reverend William White of Christ Church. This was a most delightful sight. There could not have been a more happy emblem contrived of that section of the new Constitution, or Article 6, that religious litmus prohibition, which opens all its power and offices alike, not only to every sect of Christians, but to worthy men of every religion. 80 years later, we have another firsthand account written by Naphtali Phillips, the son of Jonas Phillips and Rebecca Mendez Machado, a man who lived to be 97 years old. So in 1868, after the Civil War, the very same year that North Carolina lifted the prohibition and allowed Jews to finally be elected to public office, he recalled that federal procession. And remarkably, you can see there was provisions made for Jews who kept kosher. He says there was a number of long tables loaded with all kinds of provisions, a separate table for Jews who could not partake of the meat from the other tables. They had a full supply of salmon, bread, crackers, almonds, raisins, etc. Phillips had married Rachel Satius, the daughter of Moses from Newport, who wrote the famous letter to Washington that we'll see in a minute. And even at 16 years old in 1789, he was part of the personal escort for George Washington from Philadelphia to New York City for the very first presidential inauguration in American history, which came April 30th, 1789 in New York City, Federal Hall in the Wall Street District. Washington became our nation's first president. 14 clergy were present, including the Reverend Gershom Mendes Seixas, the brother of Moses Seixas, the spiritual leader of Congregation Cherith Israel, founded by the 23 Jews from Recife, Brazil in 1654. Seixas actually became the only Jewish trustee, the first Jewish trustee and the only one for a long time of King's College, which became Columbia College and Columbia University, the only Jew for 100 years until U.S. Justice Benjamin Cardozo, himself a descendant of Portuguese New Christians, was appointed in the 1920s. And if you look at the seal of Columbia University today, you can see the influence of the Enlightenment and even of a Jewish idea. You have very prominently in the center the Yod He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton, the Shem HaMephorish, the idea that, of course, the deity had endowed humanity, human beings, with light, with reason, and with education, one could construct a better and more educated society. Seixas, during the American Revolution, became known as the Patriot Minister. He refused to offer prayers for King George III. And in fact, when the British came and occupied New York, he closed the synagogue and took the Torah scrolls with him. He eventually fled to Philadelphia, where he became the Chazan in Mikveh Israel there. And Thanksgiving of 1789, after he had returned the hero in the American Revolution, he gave a very special sermon. So just months after offering a benediction alongside George Washington, he gave a very special sermon thanking God for the religious liberty in the United States Constitution. And when he died in 1816, a very nice obituary written by a regular non-Jewish newspaper proclaimed that he was an oracle of consultation to all sects and denominations. No minister ever lived more respected, nor died more universally lamented. And he closed a long life in full confidence of the abounding mercy of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's also interesting to note that his son-in-law, Abraham Jonas, who is seen on the bottom, was the closest friend of Abraham Lincoln. In George Washington's first term as president from 1789 to 1793, 20-odd letters were sent to Washington from Jewish and Christian denominations inquiring as to the status of religious freedom. What would the new country be like? Washington, of course, was the unrivaled, undisputed leader, the indispensable man without whom the American experiment could simply not succeed. So three letters were sent by the 6 existing Spanish and Portuguese synagogues, the 5 that we mentioned, as well as the new community of Richmond, Virginia, that was born in 1789. Initially, 1 letter was to be sent. They couldn't agree on who was to be listed first. They splintered, and 3 letters were sent by 6 synagogues. The first was sent by Savannah, Georgia, in May of 1790. The second by Newport, Rhode Island, in August of 1790. And the third was a joint letter of the other 4 in December of 1790. Also, if you can see the names, 2 of the 3 presidents, Levi Sheftel in Savannah and Manuel Josephson in Philadelphia, 2 of the 3 presidents of these Spanish and Portuguese synagogues were Ashkenazi Jews. Again, a testament to this impressive display of Sephardi Ashkenazi unity in early America. In May of 1790, Levi Sheftel, the president of Mikveh Israel, the half-brother of Mordecai Sheftel, who was one of the highest-ranking Jewish officers in the Continental Army, and son of Benjamin, one of the original arrivals to Savannah, in July 1733, sent that first letter to Washington, saying, "Your unexampled liberality and philanthropy have dispelled that cloud of bigotry and superstition, and enfranchised us with all the privileges and immunities of free citizens. May the great author of worlds grant you all happiness, an addition of years to the number of your days." Washington responded, thanking Sheftel for his words and imploring the same wonder-working deity who, long since delivering the Hebrews from their Egyptian oppressors and planted them in the Promised Land, still continue to water them with the dew of heaven and to make the inhabitants of every denomination participate in the temporal and spiritual blessings of that people. The second letter was written by Moses Seixas of Newport, Rhode Island, the brother of Gershom. Their grandfather had fled the Portuguese Inquisition. And it's interesting and important to note, everyone knows Washington's famous remarks, but he merely rephrased or reaffirmed the language, the rhetoric already by Seixas in the initial letter. And so it's Seixas who says, "Permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you, Deprived as we have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now behold a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but affords to all liberty of conscience. For these blessings of civil and religious liberty, we desire to send up our thanks to God. And when full of days and full of honor, you are gathered to your fathers, may you be admitted into the heavenly paradise to partake of the water of life and the tree of immortality. And Washington's landmark response, the greatest letter, the greatest affirmation of religious liberty in American history. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunity of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, for religious freedom is an inherent natural right. The government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell on this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. And lastly, that letter written by Manuel Josephson of Philadelphia's Mick Fitzer on behalf of the four, he says, the wonders which the Lord of hosts hath worked in the days of our forefathers have taught us to observe the greatness of his wisdom and his might throughout the late glorious revolution. And then he says to Washington, your sword, your military victories, opened the way to the reign of freedom, but it was not secure until your hand gave birth to the federal Constitution as presiding officer of the Constitutional Convention. And likewise, he says, to God, who is our refuge, we commit in our prayer the care of thy life. When full of years thou shalt be gathered unto the people, thy righteousness shall go before thee, whilst thy name and thy virtues will remain an indelible memorial on our minds. And indeed it has been. And this summer, when I was in Washington, D.C., I made the pilgrimage to Mount Vernon to pay respects to the father of our country. And Washington responded, the liberality of sentiment toward each other, which marks every political and religious denomination of men in this country, stands unparalleled in the history of nations. The affection of such people is a treasure beyond the reach of calculation. May the same temporal and eternal blessings which you implore for me rest upon your congregations. And this culminates in December of 1791 with the adoption of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. And the First Amendment, of course, enshrines liberty of conscience in religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. Particularly among them, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And other amendments prohibit the introduction of an Inquisition from ever coming to American soil. And so accordingly, from the very beginning of the history of the Republic, constitutional protections for freedom of conscience and the accused were placed at the very center of the American political and legal tradition, utterly unprecedented in the history of the Jewish diaspora and indeed in the history of the West. The commitment to religious freedom continued throughout the lives of the founders. I see Hugo, so I guess it's time to start wrapping up. But as you can see, throughout these letters written by various Jews to the founders, to Thomas Jefferson, to James Madison, there is this incredible emphasis on acceptance of Jews, integration of Jews, and all of this is a credit to the American experiment. Even at the end of his life, Jefferson notes that he wished to be remembered for only three things: author of the Declaration of Independence, father of the University of Virginia, and author of that Virginia statute for religious freedom. And at the very end of their lives, in their last letters ever written, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson say that this is what that legacy of America, of the Constitution, of July 4th will mean to succeeding generations. It won't be just a great and glorious page in the annals of America and of humanity, but it will be a day to forever refresh our recollections of these rights, including liberty of conscience. And so this marks the end. When Adams and Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, this marks the end of the Inquisition and the age of the founders. It ended together 200 years ago. The Portuguese Inquisition was abolished in 1821. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. 3 weeks later, the final victim of the Spanish Inquisition was executed. Thomas Jefferson did not live to see the end of the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was officially abolished in 1834, and only one living founder, James Madison, was alive to see it happen. And when he died in June 1836, the founders passed into history, bequeathed their legacies, above all religious liberty, to be preserved by posterity. This is my story. This is your story. I'm happy to share my family story if people are interested, my grandparents, of everyone who came to this country. But ultimately, in the end, this journey across continents and centuries, from the Inquisition to religious freedom, is not just a Jewish story. It is the story of America. It is an eternal rebuke against coercion in every form. And above all, it is the defining promise and the extraordinary legacy of this American Republic. Thank you very much.
Wow, you covered a lot of grounds. It's amazing. And okay, we will have hold on, let me unpin you. 1 second. Remove pin. All right. Okay. So I have a few questions to get us started. We still have plenty of time. Okay. We will easily have 15-20 minutes for questions. So everybody in the audience, get ready with your questions. Uh, um, and and we do want to hear your own family story eventually, a little later. Okay.
Sure.
So I will start with the first question, going back to the early part of your lecture when you said that um, the Inquisition, when they saw that Jews and conversos were spreading around the world, they demonically went after them, establishing tribunals all over the place, which is terrible. However, isn't it true that there were some parts of the world where the Jews were safe, such as in the Ottoman Empire and maybe in Northern Europe, in Amsterdam, in Hamburg, and so on? So, can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for the question. And you're exactly right. Of course, in the world in the world of Islam, the Dar al-Islam, or in the Protestant ruled cities or countries as they were emerging in that Protestant Reformation after Martin Luther's, 95 Theses in 1517. So there were places where Jews could find somewhat of toleration and respect. The Inquisition couldn't get a foothold. That's absolutely true. But my point was because of the Spanish and Portuguese conquest that went around the world, it is very limited as to where they could go to be openly professing Jews. It's also true that some conversos they felt just more comfortable living in that Iberian world. So they would rather brave the risk the Inquisition would find out that they're conversos, or if they were, say, crypto Jews, and suffer the wrath of the Inquisition than go to, say, the Ottoman Empire. Many wanted to just stay in that Spanish or Portuguese speaking world. But they wanted to again flee the Inquisition. Of course, there are a few who actually stayed even in the Iberian Peninsula itself, but that was the greatest danger. So unless one was willing to go, as you said, to the Ottoman Empire, which was a dangerous trek, or of course to Protestant cities, they very much suffered, very well could suffer the ultimate brunt of being burnt at the stake. And this is the situation that endured for centuries. And sometimes it's not impossible to afflict it up to 10, 12 generations of the same family. The names keep recurring in the inquisitorial records.
Great. Okay, so I have one more question, and then I'm urging people in the audience to prepare your questions. For example, Professor Alan Fisher, prepare your question, okay, for the next 5 minutes. My question is a very heavy one about, first, without the Jewish dimension, which is about American history, which is how come that such an enlightened revolution and constitution based on the fundamentals of the Enlightenment, how come that they tolerated slavery, okay? And what was the Jewish angle of tolerating or cooperating with slavery?
So it's a great question, and it's always one of those questions that many of us have. So in terms of, and I should note, by the way, Jewish Heritage Alliance did a three-part series in the spring on this very question of slavery and what the Jewish response was. So if you're interested to learn more, it is available. In terms of how I think it just showcases that as great as these people were, they were men. They were not gods. They were not perfect. They had their flaws. They were people of their times. They could be extraordinarily have extraordinary foresight or be progressive in a certain area of life, and in others not come to realize that. Although some of the founders do say I think they probably couldn't do it themselves. Meaning, Washington, for example, when he died, he did free his slaves. He manumitted his slaves. In fact, I think he's the only founder to do so on his death. Jefferson did not. But Jefferson, of course, in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, condemned the slave trade as one of the most odious evils in human history, though he's benefiting by having, hundreds of slaves at his own estate. So I think it just showcases the ability of the human mind to probably compartmentalize issues. You're not perfect in everything. And so, yes, it's there and it's a stain, and we need to acknowledge that. But at the same time, we can commend the founders, I think, again, for their unparalleled commitment to religious liberty. And in terms of the Jewish dimension as to slavery, it also split. There are many rabbis who pushed for abolition, and there are many who actually supported. They tried to invoke the Torah itself as a type of proof for slavery. The rabbis, no less than the founders, are men of their times, I think. And it's just the zeitgeist that and the history that we all have to live with.
Right. Thank you. I have more questions, but I will wait. Anybody ready with a question? You can use the chat. You can raise your hand, either physically or digitally. Okay, this is your chance. I have more. Okay. All right, think about it.
You're muted.
Yes? Who is this?
Speak.
It's Alan.
Okay, go.
You said I have to ask a question. So
You must, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Alan Fisher is a professor of political science, originally from California, and then for several years a member of the Beth Torah congregation, and he's a frequent speaker in our events. A great thinker. So, Alan, go ahead.
thank you. I think it was a wonderful presentation, but I think it understates the degree of anti-Semitism, even legal anti-Semitism. And you know this better than I, but in some of the states, Jews may have been allowed to hold office, but they weren't allowed to vote, even as late as the 1840s. So I think it really does understate the prevalence of anti-Semitism in much of the early colonies.
So thank you for the point, and you're certainly right. It's so much to cover in a presentation like this. I think, though, my point is that yes, there is anti-Semitism at the social level, certainly at even the legal level, at the states. This is true. But although it's certainly, I would say, at the state level, it's not even, of course, that which Jews are facing in other parts of the world. I mean, but more importantly, at the end of the day, because of the anti-Semitism or discrimination they face, even at the state level, and as I said, the 9 of the 13 states prohibit non-Christians from holding public office. That, to me, is a further testament to the founders at the federal level that they don't discriminate against Jews when it was very easy to do. Especially, we're talking again 2,500 Jews living in a land of 2 million people. That country was 98% Protestant or so at the time of the Revolution. So that, to me, again, is just a further again, a testament to the founders. As flawed as they were, that shows again how progressive and insightful they were in that issue. That structurally they did not enshrine anti-Semitism at the federal constitutional level. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Okay, my next question. So, Sephardic Jews, following your presentation in the 1700s, in the 1800s, those were the Jews of the US. You did mention that there were some Ashkenazis, but it was majority originating from Spain and Portugal. And then I want you to comment on the transition to a situation when other Jews arrive. So I believe that the proper sequence is that first the German Jews arriving in the middle of the 19th century, and eventually the huge inflow of Eastern European Jews at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. So how does the shifting of power within the Jewish community affected the way that Jews were treated by the mainstream political and economic establishment in the US?
So, Isaac, before you answer
Yeah.
that,
Go ahead.
I need to raise a point. I'm going to let you answer it. I'm not sure how much about that topic you can cover, but I would mention to you that Jewish Heritage Alliance really doesn't dwell in the generalities of the Jewish history. I'm going to let them take a stab at it, but I just want to mention that that's outside the scope of the mission. But go ahead, Isaac.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's true. I mean, it's not something I've extensively studied, but I would say that you're right, Hugo, and as to how the waves of migration occurred. Actually, it was the conversos, then followed, although you have some Ashkenazi Jews already. So again, it's very important to me, significantly. I find it fascinating too, that there's already that mixture of Sephardi Ashkenazi unity. Now, because the Sephardim or the conversos arrived first and they established those first synagogues, there is an acknowledgement, I think, that they have a precedence. They're that the Sephardic rite, the Spanish and Portuguese rite, is basically adopted. I mean, most of these cities that we talked about, the communities, Charleston, Savannah, obviously up to New York, Newport, Philadelphia, they have one synagogue for many years. In fact, I think that Sherath Israel in New York City is the only synagogue until 1825, even though it's already become majority Ashkenazi. So already there you have that interesting history going on. And then of course there's successive waves that come, and you do see, I think, a different type perhaps of anti-Semitism even in the 19th century begin to emerge with these Jews, as you said, coming from Germany, and particularly the 2 million Jews or so fleeing the Tsarist anti-Semitism from 1880 to 1920 or so. My own grandmother among them on my mom's side. So um, I'm not sure to what any demonstrable effect it changes the nature of it, but I think that it does showcase that people, Jews, I think in some cases, and non-Jews, they don't realize how early Jews came, either as conversos or Sephardic Jews and those few Ashkenazi Jews. People think they only came in the 1880s or 1900s, and we need to be
Right.
educating and saying that's not true. They were here in the 15, 1600s. They fought in the American Revolution. They were very prominent in the birth of the Republic.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to support that point that the whole essence of your lecture today was to highlight the incredible contribution of those Sephardic Jews in the early days of America.
Right.
So I think that this is a good time for you to spend a few minutes telling us about your own family. Where did they come from, and what are your own personal roots?
Oh, sure. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And if I can, I'll just share because I do have the pictures if anyone wants to see. Or
Yes. Please do. Please do. Go back to sharing.
okay, yeah, just be a minute. So my Amon, my surname is from Turkey back to Spain. So this is an illustration of my putative ancestor. I haven't made exactly the direct connection, but almost certainly a remote ancestor, Moses Amon, on the right, who was actually born in Granada, Spain, fled the 1492 Edict of Expulsion, and eventually went to Constantinople or Istanbul, where he became the physician to Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in the 1540s, 1550s or so. And these are my grandparents on my dad's side, my Sephardic and Mizrahi side. So my grandfather, for whom I'm named, of course, from Istanbul, who spoke 7 languages, including Ladino, the language of the Spanish exiles, who met Ataturk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, and who ended up becoming a professor of engineering at the University of Illinois in Chicago, the Circle campus. And then my grandmother, from Aleppo, or Halab, or Aram Soba in biblical terms. She really grew up in Beirut, spoke 5 languages, Arabic, French, was a nurse in Beirut with the Red Cross, and then ended up working at the Marshall Field store in State Street in Chicago. And they were married by the chief rabbi, the Hacham Bashi, in 1952, as you can see in the photo. My dad was born in 53. And there's actually just a whole other story. There was some anti-Semitism in Istanbul as well, and including some pogroms in 55 against the Greeks and Armenians, but it impacted the Jews. So my grandfather felt there was no future, unfortunately, in Turkey. And so he got a job in Chicago. And my dad, who was 3, 4 years old, they moved to Chicago, and that's where my dad grew up. And then my Ashkenazi side, my mom's parents, my grandfather, whom actually lived with us for 17 years growing up. So I was very privileged to see him every day. Delivered milk by horse and buggy, lived through the Great Depression as a young adult, served in the American Army during World War II, enduring anti-Semitism from within his own unit. And my grandmother, who was actually born in Ukraine, in the Russian Empire, who survived a pogrom at the age of 3, hiding in a barrel of hay, and arrived at Ellis Island in 1922. And so I like to say that one of my favorite memories of all my grandparents of blessed memory is the Passover table, when you could hear Yiddish, Ladino, Arabic, French all together, the unity through diversity. So thank you for the question. And I'm sure it's very similar for everyone here. But that's, of course, why it's deeply personal, too. So and all of them came here. And I think at the end of the day, for me, that's also what showcases the extraordinary story of America. It's the convergence of these 3 great civilizational branches of the Jewish people, of Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi. It's just chapters of the same story.
Okay, Professor Amon, you did a fantastic job. I want to thank you very much. Great job.
Thank you. Thank you.
Amazing. Very, very educational, very interesting. So now that's it. We have to invite you for a follow-up lecture on one of the other topics that you're an expert in. And in order to wrap up this event, I want to invite Michael Steinberger to say a few concluding remarks. And Michael, let me ask you something. I know that the Jewish Heritage Alliance, the strength of the organization lies, I think, in 2 directions: organizing educational events and lectures, lots of them, but also organizing very interesting trips to the Jewish communities around the world. You didn't mention those before. Can you, before you wrap up the event, can you elaborate a little bit? You have 3-4 minutes to talk about that.
Well, thank you for that. So yeah, look, the mission for Jewish Heritage Alliance, I mentioned in the opening remarks, is to research, to preserve, and most importantly, to promote. And we do that on a variety of different platforms. So this is our most popular. We are very big on educational events in all forms, usually webinars, mostly online, sometimes live. We do our with Cage as well. So education is a big platform for us. The tours that we promote are very unique in as much as there are many Jewish heritage tours. I mean, we didn't invent that idea. Ours stand apart because they are specifically designed to bring the legacy of Sefarad to life. So our tours are they're limited to areas, regions that are Sefarad specific. Most popular is our Portugal. We've been doing Portugal now for about 7 years running. So I think now we have Portugal, Spain, Morocco. We just introduced Brazil. Brazil is a very, very interesting part of the saga. So yeah, our programs, they're led, each of our tours are led by an academic expert. So you would have someone like an Isaac actually lead the tour. So they're truly an on-site learning experience, and I think they stand apart for that reason. So yeah, anyone who's interested, we just launched our 26 programs, and you're welcome to check in with us, and we'll send you information. So thanks for the opportunity.
If I can reinforce your point, I think that the situation is the following. I think that we all want members of the Jewish community to know more about Jewish history, to be more aware of the history of the various segments of the Jewish community, Ashkenazi and Sephardic. But it so happens that in terms of the most commonly studied and visited parts of the world have to do a little more with the Ashkenazic tradition than with the Sephardic tradition, the Jews from Sefarad. So I think that the Jewish Heritage Alliance is trying to balance that a little bit by saying, wait a moment, we have an incredible history of the Jews of Sefarad, and let us all strengthen our knowledge about it.
So let me echo that. So let me echo that with a quick response. It's a very important point you made. So obviously my last name is Steinberger, so there's nothing Sephardi about my heritage. I literally fell across the the legacy of Sefarad. But there are no coincidences in life, but I would say coincidentally. My day job, my professional background happens to be in tourism. Not the reason we have tours, by the way, but that's my day job, if you will. That's my professional background. And through that experience is how I literally fell across the story. And I want to echo what you just said. So people will often ask me, what's an Ashkenazi kid doing promoting the legacy of Sefarad? And so the first answer is it's a Jewish story. You know, there's no distinction, Sephardi, Ashkenazi. In fact, 70% of all Jewry at that period lived in the Iberian Peninsula. People don't know that. So a lot of people think that they're from, Hungary or Czechoslovakia or Russia. Their heritage might very well be, their origins might very well be in Sefarad. But the point I wanted to say is when I discovered the story of Sefarad, like most, if not definitely many, but most, I knew nothing about the Sefarad legacy. I mean, as you stated, being an Ashkenazi by birth, and the majority of the history is Ashkenazi sort of directed, if you will. The reason I launched Jewish Heritage Alliance is because as an Ashkenazi, I realized that it is a profound, wide-ranging part of not only Jewish history, but as you heard from today's presentation, it's part of world history. You know, I would say this before I close. You know, the legacy of Sefarad, even though we refer to it in historical, ways, it's not limited, to history or to any particular time. One of the things you'll learn as you follow us, and it's God willing, we'll give you more programs, the story of Sefarad lives everywhere. It is a very profound part of life that most people are not aware. And I'll give you one closing example. We are about 14, depending who you ask, maybe 15 million Jews in the world today. That's it. The conversos, or the descendants of the conversos that Isaac spoke about, and I'm glad you're all sitting down, they number over 200 million people. I said 200 million. We are 14 million, and the descendants of those who were forced to convert are over 200 million. Why is that significant? Imagine if we could, and we are working, imagine if we could coalesce 50 of these million, 25 of these million people to connect with their Jewish heritage. And we know people who are descendants of conversos who do connect with their Jewish heritage, and they become very much pro-Israel, much pro the Jewish nation. And so the story of Sefarad is not ended. It's ongoing. It lives almost everywhere, and I'm fascinated. I've been doing this for 11 years, and I'm still as excited and as passionate about the Sefarad legacy as I was the day I discovered it. So thanks for pointing that out.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, I feel obligated to add a few thoughts about this subject, which is the following. First of all, on a personal note, I am Ashkenazi on both sides, but I was born in Latin America. I'm fluent in Spanish. And during the pandemic, I decided to study Ladino, like in a serious way. Okay, so I am now fluent in Ladino, and I started studying more and more about the Ottoman Empire and the way that the Jews from Spain and Portugal prospered and developed in the Ottoman Empire, but also in Italy, in cities like Livorno and so on. Like you say, it's such a tremendously rich history. I also happened to study the history of the city of Amsterdam and the golden era of Amsterdam during the time of Rembrandt and so on. And the Jews, the Portuguese Jews in the city of Amsterdam had a tremendously important role. I looked at the history of the Jews in India, and then you have a bunch of a significant chapter of the history of the Jews of India has to do with Jews from Sefarad that ended up in India. One more, northern Mexico. I have professional activities in the city of Monterrey in northern Mexico. And there are many families, non-Jewish families, with last name like Garza, 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 okay? And Garza in Spanish is the name of an animal, a deer or something like that. And it, I was told that all the non-Jewish names with last names like the name of an animal were originally Jewish, Sephardic Jews in northern Mexico. And you hear stories from people that tell you, well, my family has been Christian forever, but I remember that for some reason my grandma on Fridays used to light candles and, all of a sudden, like Jewish tradition. So, like you said, it's all over. It's super interesting. And it's a food for thought for this group. So once again, thank you, Michael, for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you, Isaac, for a wonderful, wonderful lecture. And thank you, everybody in the audience. We had a great group. Thank you, everybody. And stay tuned. We will have more activities. Happy Hanukkah, everybody. Hanukkah is coming up. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.